The letter fell out of the saddlebag and hit the dry earth of Redemption Valley like a verdict. Nellie Langston stared at it. She had recognized the pale blue envelope before it even finished its slow, terrible tumble from the leather pouch. She had recognized it because she had written it herself, 14 months ago, in a boarding house in St. Louis with ink-stained fingers and a heart that was barely holding its own seams together. She had written it and addressed it to Marshal Daniel Sawyer of Redemption Valley, Colorado Territory, and she had told him in the plainest words she had ever assembled that she was not coming back. And here it was, folded and unread, tucked away like a secret that never wanted to die. Daniel stood 3 feet away from her, his hand frozen in the act of reaching for his saddlebag. His face had gone the color of old ash. His jaw was locked so tight she could see the muscle working beneath the skin of his cheek. He was wearing his marshal's badge. Of course he was wearing his badge. Even now, even in the moment where the floor was falling out from under both of their lives, Daniel Sawyer wore his badge like armor. "You never read it," Nellie said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of that stable yard, it carried like a gunshot. Daniel did not answer. "You told me you read it." She took 1 step toward him and her boot crunched on the dry, summer-baked ground. "You told me you understood. You told me, Daniel, you told me that was why you never wrote back, because I had made myself clear." He bent slowly and picked the letter up. He held it at his side in fingers that were not entirely steady. "I kept it," he said. "I can see that. That is not the same thing as reading it." The words hung between them in the hot afternoon air of Redemption Valley, in the late August of 1878, and Nellie felt the ground shift beneath everything she had believed about the last 14 months of her life. Every decision she had made. Every door she had closed. Every cold night in St. Louis when she had told herself that he had read her words and had simply chosen not to fight for her. He had not read it. He had folded it into his saddlebag and carried it with him through every mile of dust and danger that the Colorado Territory could produce, and he had never once opened it, and nobody in the valley knew. Nobody in Redemption Valley knew that the marshal had kept her return letter folded inside his saddlebag. Until right now. And right now, Nellie Langston realized with a force that hit her somewhere beneath her ribs, was the exact moment her carefully assembled new life was about to come completely apart. She had arrived back in Redemption Valley 48 hours ago, and she had not come back for Daniel Sawyer. She had told herself that quite firmly on the stage from Pueblo. She had come back because her father, Hector Langston, had suffered a serious fall from the roof of his house while making repairs, and the telegram from old Me Dooley had said the doctor was not certain he would walk again. She had come back for her father. That was all. She had told herself that so many times between Pueblo and Redemption that the words had begun to lose their shape. Because the truth, the dangerous, inconvenient, deeply buried truth, was that Nellie Langston had left Redemption Valley 14 months ago not because she stopped loving Daniel Sawyer, but because she could not survive loving him the way she had been doing it. Waiting. Always waiting. Waiting for the next threat against his life, the next wanted poster nailed to the office door. The next night she lay awake counting the minutes until she heard his boots on the porch steps. She had been 23 years old, and she had already aged a decade in the shadow of his badge. So she had written him a letter. She had told him she was leaving for St. Louis, where her cousin Martha lived and where there was work in a milliner's shop, and where she would not have to watch the road every night wondering if he was coming home. She had told him she cared for him deeply, but that she needed a life that did not feel like a held breath. She had told him she wished him well, truly and completely. And she had believed for 14 months that he had read every word. Now she stood in the stable yard of her father's house with the late summer sun beating down on the back of her neck, and Daniel Sawyer was holding her letter in his hand with the stillness of a man who was either very calm or was just barely preventing himself from falling to pieces. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you keep it without reading it?" He looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Because if I read it," he said, "then whatever it said would be the truth." and I could not afford to know the truth and still do my job." She stared at him. "That is the most stubborn thing I have ever heard in my life." "Probably." He tucked the letter into his coat pocket. "It is good to see you, Nellie. How is your father?" She almost laughed. The audacity of the pivot. The sheer, iron-spined audacity of Daniel Sawyer changing the subject when the subject was the most important one either of them had ever faced. She had forgotten in St. Louis exactly how infuriating he could be. She had also forgotten, she was realizing with considerable alarm, exactly how his presence felt in a room, or in a stable yard. He was 31 years old now, and the Colorado sun had put new lines beside his eyes and the work had put new weight in his shoulders. And he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes of his the way he always had, like he was measuring the distance between where they were and where they ought to be. "He is resting," she said. "Dr. Marsh says he may walk with a cane if he is careful. He needs someone to stay with him through the fall." "I know. Me Dooley told me you came in on the Tuesday stage." He paused. "I would have met you at the station. I did not want to be met." "I know that too." The silence between them was the kind that had texture and weight. Nellie picked up the small traveling bag she had set down when the letter fell, and she squared her shoulders. "I am going inside to sit with my father," she said. "We can be civil while I am in town, Daniel. There is no reason for things to be difficult." He nodded once, but his hand was in his coat pocket, resting on the letter she had written 14 months ago, and his eyes were following her to the door. And Nellie Langston knew with absolute certainty that things were going to be very, very difficult. Hector Langston was propped up in his iron-framed bed with 3 pillows, and a temperament that the injury had done nothing to improve. He was 56 years old and built like a man who had spent 30 years fighting the land for every acre he owned, which was exactly what he was. His white hair was standing in several conflicting directions, and his splinted leg was elevated on a bolster cushion that he clearly resented. "You took long enough getting from the station," he said by way of greeting. "I stopped in the stable yard." Nellie set her bag down and kissed his rough cheek. "You look terrible." "I fell off a roof." He studied her face with the shrewd brown eyes she had inherited. "You saw Daniel." It was not a question. "His horse was at the fence. I assume he checked on you this morning." "He checks on me every morning. Has done since the day after I fell." Her father shifted against his pillows and made a sound that was partly pain and partly pure aggravation. "Good man, Daniel Sawyer, always was, Papa." She sat in the ladder-back chair beside the bed and folded her hands in her lap. "Do not start." "I am not starting anything. I am stating facts." He fixed her with a look that had outlasted multiple arguments over the years. "You left that man without so much as a spoken word." "I left him a letter." "A letter." He said it the way he would say the word cowardice if he were trying to be polite about it. "It expressed everything I needed to say." "Did it?" He settled back. "And what did he say to it?" Nellie was quiet for just long enough to give herself away. Her father turned his head and looked at her more carefully. "He did not answer," she said, "which told me everything I needed to know about how he felt." Hector Langston made a low sound in his chest. He said nothing more, but his expression was the particular one that meant he knew something she did not and was deciding whether to say it. Nellie did not ask. She reached for the water pitcher on the nightstand and poured him a glass, and she talked about Martha's new baby in St. Louis, and she described the milliner's shop, and she kept her voice even and her hands steady, and she did not think about a pale blue envelope tucked into a coat pocket. She thought about it constantly. Redemption Valley in August of 1878 was a town that had grown 3 sizes since Nellie had left it. The cattle trade had brought money into the valley, the way water fills a dry creek bed, suddenly and with considerable force. There was a new hotel on Main Street, 2 new saloons, a proper telegraph office, and a bathhouse that had opened just before Christmas. The population had swelled to nearly 400 souls, not counting the ranches that ringed the valley like loose stitches on a quilt. With population came commerce, and with commerce came the kind of trouble that required a marshal with both a clear head and a fast hand. Daniel Sawyer had been that marshal for 4 years. He had taken the job at 27 when the previous marshal, old Ben Hart, had retired to his sister's place in New Mexico. The town council had debated the appointment for 3 weeks and had ultimately chosen Daniel because he was the only candidate who had looked the council president straight in the eye and said, quietly, that he would do the job the right way or not at all, and they had believed him. They had been right, too. In 4 years, Daniel had reduced the serious crime rate in Redemption Valley to near nothing. He had navigated the complicated politics of the cattle barons with patience and fairness. He had handled disputes between homesteaders and ranchers without favoring either side. He had arrested 3 men for murder and seen all 3 properly tried and convicted in the territorial court. He had done it all with the same steady, unreadable composure that made certain people think he did not feel things deeply. Nellie had once known better. She had known it in the winter of 1876, when she was 22, and helping me duly run the boarding house, and Daniel had come in from 3 days tracking a horse thief through a January blizzard, frostbitten and exhausted, and she had been the one to make sure there was hot food and dry clothes. He had sat at me's kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and he had looked at her across the table in the lamplight with an expression that had stripped away all that composure and shown her something underneath it that she had never been able to forget. Something that looked remarkably like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just, for one moment, been allowed to set it down. They had not begun as sweethearts immediately. It had built slowly, the way things build in small places where people see each other daily. A habit of conversation, an easy understanding, small kindnesses traded back and forth like currency. He had started finding reasons to come to me's in the evenings, and she had started saving the chair nearest the window because she had noticed it was the one he preferred. By spring of 1877, the whole valley had understood what was happening between them before either of them had said a word about it out loud. He had kissed her for the first time in May, on the back steps of me's house, with the smell of lilac in the air and the last light going out of the sky. He had been characteristically direct about it. He had said, "Nellie, I would very much like to kiss you," and she had said, "Then you should," and he had. And it had been the kind of kiss that rearranges the furniture of a person's interior life and does not arrange it back the way it was before. They had been together for nearly 8 months, and they had been good months, genuinely and unambiguously good, right up until the night that Walt Decker had taken a shot at Daniel from the roof of the saloon, and the bullet had missed his head by 4 inches. Nellie had been sitting in me's parlor when she heard the shot. She had not known, in the seconds before me came running in with the news, whether Daniel was alive or dead. She had sat in that parlor with her heart stopped in her chest, and when she found out he was fine, unhurt, she had gone into the kitchen and stood at the sink with her hands shaking for 20 minutes straight. That was when she had understood that the way she loved Daniel Sawyer was also the most frightening thing about her life. She had wrestled with it for 2 months after that. She had told herself that fear was not a good enough reason to leave something real. She had told herself that all love carried risk. She had told herself many sensible, rational things. And then one night in late October, she had sat down at the desk in her room and written the letter by lamplight. And by the time she finished it, she understood that she had already made her decision. She had left on the Thursday stage. She had given the letter to me duly with instructions to have it delivered to the marshal's office. She had not said goodbye to Daniel in person because she was not certain she could do it if she looked at him. That was the dark past she carried in her chest every day she spent in St. Louis. And now she was back, and the letter had never been read, and the man who had carried it for 14 months was currently standing in her father's stable yard with her pale blue envelope in his coat pocket, and Nellie Langston was not at all sure she was capable of the emotional mathematics that the next few weeks were going to require. The first 3 days were an exercise in careful geography. Redemption Valley was not large enough to make avoidance possible, but it was large enough that two people who knew what they were doing could limit their contact to brief, civil interactions in public spaces. Good morning at the post office. A polite nod across the street. A short exchange on the steps of Doc Marsh's office when Nellie came to collect her father's medicine. "He is improving," Daniel said, referring to Hector. "Slowly," Nellie said, "but yes. Let me know if you need anything. We will manage." She was aware that he watched her walk away. She was aware of it the way you are aware of sunlight on the back of your neck. She did not look back. On the fourth day, the careful geography collapsed. She was at Henderson's general store, pricing flour and dried beans, when a commotion erupted outside on the main street. She heard raised voices, then the specific heavy thud of a body hitting the ground, and then the unmistakable sound of Daniel Sawyer's voice cutting through the noise with the particular authority that did not require volume to command attention. She went to the store window because she could not help it. On the street, a man she did not recognize, large, red-faced, clearly drunk at 11 in the morning, was being helped to his feet by two bystanders while Daniel stood 2 feet away with his arms crossed and his badge catching the light. The man was saying something aggressive that she could not hear through the glass, jabbing a finger toward Daniel with the specific belligerence of someone who did not yet understand the nature of the situation he was in. Daniel spoke. She could not hear the words, but the man's finger came down and his posture changed, and within 30 seconds he was walking peaceably toward the jail with Daniel a step behind him, and the street returned to its ordinary rhythms. Mrs. Henderson appeared at Nellie's elbow. She was a small, round woman of 50 who had operated the store with her husband for 15 years and who had the specific social omniscience of someone who paid very close attention to everything. "Still something to watch, is he not?" she said mildly, looking at the street. "He handled that efficiently," Nellie said, in the neutral tone she was using for all Daniel-adjacent conversations. Mrs. Henderson moved back toward the counter. "He has been very steady this past year, very focused." She began wrapping Nellie's purchases. "I think he was worried for a while, after you left. Not that he ever said anything, of course. That man never says anything he does not absolutely have to say, but you could see it in him, like something had gone quiet in a bad way." Nellie set her coins on the counter. "I am sure he was fine. I am sure he told himself the same thing." Mrs. Henderson handed over the wrapped parcel. "It is good to have you back, Nellie, whatever the circumstances." She walked home through the afternoon heat with her parcel under her arm and something uncomfortable unfolding in her chest. Like something had gone quiet in a bad way. She turned the phrase over in her mind and did not like what it meant. That evening, after her father had eaten and was sleeping, she sat on the front porch in the cooling dark and allowed herself, for the first time, to think clearly about the question she had been avoiding. If he had not read the letter, if he had simply carried it, sealed and unread, for 14 months, then what had he believed all that time? What story had he been living inside? Had he thought she was simply gone? Had he gone to the stage station the day after she left and found out she had purchased a ticket to Pueblo? Had he gone to me and asked? What had me told him? Had he simply understood from the fact of her absence that she had chosen to leave, without knowing the specific words she had used to explain why? And if so, if he had spent 14 months not knowing the specific why, then what had he concluded? Had he assumed she had simply stopped caring? Had he assumed she had found the life in redemption too rough, the way some women did? Had he assumed she had found someone else? The thought sat on her like a stone. The night insects were loud in the grass. Down the road she could see the lights of the main street and the faint drift of piano music from the larger of the two saloons. This was the valley she had grown up in, and it felt different now than it had when she left, and she was not entirely sure how much of that was the valley and how much of it was herself. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the road and recognized the particular rhythm of them before she looked up. Daniel stopped at the gate. He was out of his work clothes, in a plain shirt and his dark coat, and he was carrying his hat in his hand. The absence of his hat made him look different. Younger somehow, more like the man she had sat across from in Mee Dooley's kitchen in the lamplight. "Is it all right if I come in?" he asked. She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. "Yes," she said. He came up the porch steps and stood for a moment, and then when she gestured to the other chair, he sat down. They were quiet for a while. The piano music drifted. A horse moved in the stable. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do not owe me anything." Nellie, just her name, in that particular way he said it with a kind of careful weight, like the name mattered more than most words. "Please let me say this." She folded her hands in her lap and nodded. "When me gave me the letter the morning after you left," he began, "I was already 3 hours into looking for you. I had gone to your father and he told me you had gone on the Thursday stage, and I went to the station, and the agent confirmed you had taken a ticket to Pueblo." He paused. He was looking at the street, not at her. "I stood in the station for a while. I had the letter in my hand and I looked at it and I thought that if I read it, it would close something. It would be the end in a formal way, and I was not ready for that to be formally ended." Nellie said nothing. "So I put it in my saddlebag," he said. "I told myself I would read it when I was ready, and every day for a while I would think about it and decide I was not yet ready, and then it became something I just carried. A habit. I knew it was there." He turned his hat in his hands. "I knew it was there every day for 14 months. The night air between them felt charged with something that Nellie could not name and did not trust herself to name. "What I did was not fair to you," he said quietly. "You wrote me something. You took the trouble to say what needed saying in writing because that was what you needed to do, and I did not read it. That was not respect." "No," she agreed. "It was not. I am sorry for that." She looked at him, at the side of his face in the dim light from the window, at the set of his jaw and the lines beside his eyes and the way he was holding his hat with both hands like it was something that required steadying. "What do you intend to do with it now?" she asked. He was quiet for a beat. "That depends on whether you are willing to let me read it now, or whether you would rather tell me what it said." She had not expected that. She had expected him to say something about reading it on his own time, privately. The directness of the offer was so entirely like him that it briefly made her chest hurt. "It said," she began carefully, "that I was leaving because I was frightened. Not of you, of what it felt like to love someone in your position, someone whose work put them in danger regularly. I told you I could not continue to build my life around waiting to find out if you were coming home." She paused. "I told you I cared for you deeply, and that was exactly why I could not stay." The silence that followed was the kind that settles after a difficult truth lands. "I know," he said very quietly. She looked at him sharply. "You knew." "I did not know from the letter. But I thought about it. After you left, I had a great deal of time to think about what you would have said." He finally looked at her. "I knew you had not stopped caring for me, Nellie. I knew it because of the way you left. If you had simply stopped caring, you would have told me to my face. You left without saying goodbye because you could not say it out loud. I knew that." She was very grateful it was dark on the porch because she was not entirely in control of her expression at that moment. "That changes nothing about the situation," she said, and her voice was steadier than she deserved credit for. "The situation is the same as it was 14 months ago. Is it? You are still the marshal. You are still walking into danger as a regular part of your employment. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "And you are still in love with me." She opened her mouth and closed it. The audacity, the absolute iron-nerved, frontier-forged audacity of Daniel Sawyer. "You have no basis for saying that," she said. He looked at her without blinking. "Nellie, you came out here and you sat on this porch tonight. You did not go inside when you heard my boots on the road. You answered yes when I asked if I could come in. Common courtesy. You have your father's brown eyes, and they are doing the exact same thing right now that they were doing in me Dooley's kitchen in January of 1877 when I came in from the blizzard." He said it gently, not triumphantly, just like a man stating a fact that mattered enormously. "I am not saying it to corner you. I am saying it because I think you deserve to know that you are not carrying that alone." She stood up. She needed to stand up. She needed the physical act of standing between her and what she was feeling. "I am here for my father," she said. "That is the only reason I am here. I know. and when he is recovered enough to manage on his own, I will go back to St. Louis. All right. So there is no this conversation should not go any further than it already has. Probably not tonight, he agreed and stood and put his hat on and looked at her across the porch with those steady gray eyes. Good night, Nellie. Good night, she said, and watched him go down the steps and through the gate and along the dark road, and she sat back down in her chair and put her hands over her face and sat there until she was sure her father was not awake to see her through the window. The weeks that followed were not what Nellie had planned. She had planned a simple, structured stay, care for her father, maintain a polite distance from Daniel, be gone by October. She had a life in St. Louis that was not dramatic or dangerous, and that suited her perfectly well, she had told herself. Even though if she was honest with herself the milliner's shop was merely adequate, and her cousin Martha's house was comfortable but not home, and she had spent 14 months being thoroughly fine in a way that had never quite tipped over into being actually happy. What actually happened was that Redemption Valley in September of 1878 was a very small place, and lives in small places are not amenable to simple structures. Hector Langston was a better patient now that his daughter was home, but he was still largely confined to bed for at least another 3 weeks, and he required provisions and medications, and the kind of daily management that kept Nellie constantly on the move through the town. She was in Henderson's every other day, at Doc Marsh's twice a week, at the post office regularly for her father's correspondence. Redemption was not large enough that she could perform these errands without encountering Daniel, and Daniel was not a man who could be in proximity to a person he cared about without offering whatever practical assistance was available. He helped her carry a heavy order from Henderson's on a Tuesday when he happened to be on the street. He checked the roof of her father's house, where Hector had been attempting his repairs, and found 2 more loose boards that needed attention, and he fixed them on a Saturday morning without being asked, which she discovered when she came around the side of the house with a bucket, and found him up there with a hammer and a handful of nails. He showed up on Wednesday evenings, which she discovered was when his deputy carver took the evening watch, and he would sit on the porch with Hector for an hour, and Hector would be in notably better spirits afterward, which made it impossible for Nellie to reasonably object to the visits. She told herself she was not looking forward to Wednesday evenings. She told herself this with less and less conviction as September progressed. Because sitting between the two of them on that porch in the cooling evenings, with her father's dry humor and Daniel's quiet responses, and the valley settling into its night sounds around them, was the most at home Nellie had felt in 14 months. And she resented it. She resented it the way you resent a wound that is healing when you have built your entire current plan around the assumption that it would not. She also began, slowly and against her will, to revise her understanding of who Daniel Sawyer currently was. She had left a man she loved but could not live with, a man who was all duty and composure and difficult silences, who was devoted to a job that asked things of him she could not watch it ask. And there was still that man. She could see him in the way he moved through the town, in the authority he carried, in the absolute steadiness he brought to every situation that would have made other men reach for their guns. But there was also something else. There was the Daniel who had been caring for her father every morning for weeks without being asked. There was the man who had fixed the roof. There was the man who had sat across from her in the dark and said, quietly and without drama, that she was not carrying what she felt alone. There was the man who had carried her letter, unread, in his saddlebag for 14 months, which was one of the most simultaneously infuriating and heartbreaking things she had ever heard of another human being doing. She started paying attention to the small things, the way he always asked about Hector first, the way he listened when her father talked, actually listened, not with the performing listening that people often did. The way he had quietly arranged with Henderson's to extend her father's credit line so Nellie could get what was needed without worrying about the cost, which she only found out because Mrs. Henderson mentioned it in passing, and then looked immediately like she had said something she was not supposed to. "He did not want you to know," Mrs. Henderson confirmed when Nellie pressed her. "Why not?" The older woman gave her a look that suggested the question answered itself, and went back to weighing out coffee beans. That evening Nellie waited until her father was asleep, and then she walked down to the marshal's office, which was lit against the dark at the end of Main Street. She knocked on the door. "Come in," Daniel said, and looked up from his desk where he was working through some paperwork, and went still when he saw it was her. She came in and closed the door behind her, and stood in the middle of the small office with its pine board floor and its rack of rifles on the wall and its 2 empty cells at the back, and the lamp on the desk throwing a warm circle of light. "You arranged credit with Henderson's," she said. He set his pen down. He looked like a man who had been caught doing something kind and was mildly irritated about it. "Your father's account needed maintaining while he cannot work. That is not your responsibility." "No," he agreed. "I did it anyway." "Daniel," she took a breath. "You cannot simply do things like that and expect me not to notice." "I did not do it for your attention." He leaned back in his chair. He looked at her steadily. "I did it because Hector Langston spent 30 years building that property and raising you on it, and he fell off a roof while trying to maintain it, which is a thing that can happen to any man who does physical work, and his account at Henderson's was going to be a problem within 3 weeks. I have the means and the inclination to help. I helped." It was such a plain, direct, Daniel Sawyer answer that she did not know what to do with it. "You have to stop," she said. "Do I?" "I cannot. I am leaving in October. You know that. And every time you do something like this, you make it harder." He stood up from the desk and came around it, and he stopped when he was close enough that she would have to take a step to close the distance between them. He did not close it himself. He just stood there, looking at her with those gray eyes that had always seen her more clearly than was comfortable. "Nellie," he said, "I am not doing these things to trap you. I am not trying to manipulate your plans. I am doing them because this is who I am." He paused. "And I think part of what happened 14 months ago is that you forgot who I am when I am not at work. I think the fear took up enough space that the rest of me got lost behind it." She wanted to argue with that. She searched for the argument and could not find it in its usual place. "The fear is still real," she said. "I know. It does not disappear because you fixed a roof and settled an account. I know that too. So what exactly are you proposing here?" The question came out with an edge she had not intended. "What is it that you want, Daniel? Say it plainly." He was quiet for a beat. In the lamplight his face was very still. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you wrote in that letter, the reason you gave for leaving, I have thought about it every day. Not because I read it, because I knew what was in it even without reading it. And I have thought about whether there is any version of this where you do not have to carry that fear. I have not found the answer yet, but I have not stopped looking for it." He met her eyes. "That is what I want you to know, that I am not done." She left the office 5 minutes later without saying the thing that was pressing against the inside of her chest. She walked home through the dark and went to bed and lay awake for a very long time. She was not done either. That was the truth she had been carrying since Tuesday's stage from Pueblo. That was the truth that had made every morning in St. Louis feel like a room with the wrong dimensions. She had not been done with Daniel Sawyer. She had simply not known what to do with the fact of that. In the middle of September, the thing happened that Nellie had always known, somewhere underneath everything, would eventually happen, and it changed what was possible to pretend. She was in the Mercantile with Mrs. Henderson when the sound of shouting erupted from the street, and then a single gunshot, and then the specific terrible silence that follows a gunshot in a populated place. She ran to the door with 2 other women who had been in the store. Through the window she could see a scramble of movement outside the bank 2 doors down, and she could see Daniel crossing the street at a run toward it. "Stay inside, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice flat and certain, and took hold of Nellie's arm. What followed was 18 minutes. She knew it was 18 minutes because the clock on Henderson's wall was directly in her line of sight and she watched every one of them pass. The women in the store were silent. Mrs. Henderson's hand remained on Nellie's arm. Nellie stood at the window and watched the front of the bank. There had been a robbery. She understood that much from fragments of what she could see. 2 men had attempted to rob the bank. One had come back out when Daniel intercepted him, and there had been a struggle, and the shot had been fired. The other robber was still inside with 2 bank employees. What she could see was Daniel standing at an angle to the bank door, shielded by the overhang post, speaking in through the open doorway. She could not hear any of it. She could see him standing there in that particular way of his steady, unhurried, completely focused, and she could see that the shot had not hit him because he was still standing and moving under his own power. But she did not know, for those 18 minutes, whether a second shot would come. She had forgotten. These past comfortable weeks on the porch with her father and the Wednesday evenings and the fixing of roofs and the settling of accounts, what the feeling was. The stopped-heart feeling. The cold floor opening up beneath her. She stood at the window of Henderson's Mercantile in September of 1878, and she felt all of it come back, every bit of it, exactly as she had described it in the letter she had written and he had never read. At the end of the 18 minutes, the second robber came out with his hands above his head, and Daniel walked him toward the jail. And from the bank door Mr. Abels, the bank manager, came out shaking and unhurt, and then his clerk Miss Parker after him, and the street slowly resumed itself. Nellie stood at the window for another full minute after everyone started moving again. Then she said, very quietly, to nobody in particular, "I need some air," and went out the back of the store into the alley behind it. She sat down on a barrel behind Henderson's and put her hands on her knees and breathed. The familiar, shameful, particular terror of it moved through her in waves. She was 24 years old and she was sitting on a barrel in an alley shaking slightly, and there was absolutely no dignified interpretation of this situation. What was absolutely clear, however, in a way that it had not been clear before this moment, was that the fear had not gone anywhere in 14 months. She had not outrun it in St. Louis. She had merely placed it in a context where it had nothing specific to attach to, which was not the same thing as healing it. It had been waiting here, in Redemption Valley, in the specific shape of Daniel Sawyer crossing a street at a run toward a bank robbery. She was still sitting there when she heard boots in the alley. She looked up. Daniel had seen her from the street. She supposed she was not entirely invisible from the mouth of the alley, and he came around the building and stopped when he saw her face. He did not say anything. He came and crouched down in front of her barrel so he was at her eye level, and he looked at her, and what was in his face was not triumph or pity or the careful management of a difficult emotion. It was just concern, direct and unguarded. "I am all right," she said before he could speak. "I know. I can see that you are physically all right." He stayed where he was, crouched in the dust of the alley at her level. This was not easy to watch. It was not. She looked down at her hands. They had stopped shaking, but the aftermath of the adrenaline was still moving through her. "This is what I wrote about in the letter." "I know." He was quiet. "Do you want to tell me what it feels like?" "So I understand it from the inside." She looked at him. The question had so little performance in it. He genuinely wanted to know. "It feels," she said slowly, "like the floor disappears, all of it in 1 second. Everything I have built and arranged and told myself is safe, all of it falls through. And I cannot control it. I know perfectly well intellectually that you are capable and experienced and that you manage these situations better than anyone else in this valley could. I know that. But the knowledge does not reach the fear. They are in different rooms." He nodded slowly. He did not say, "I understand," because he did not say things he was not certain of. He said, "I hear you." "It does not go away," she said. "In St. Louis I thought perhaps it would. That with distance it would soften into something manageable, but it did not soften. It just had nothing to land on." "So the fear followed you to St. Louis?" "Yes." He sat down on the ground properly then in the alley dust, his back against the building, his long legs crossed in front of him. It was a startlingly un-Marshal-like posture, and it made her want to cry for no reason she could clearly identify. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what I could actually offer you that might be different, not what I could promise. I do not make promises I cannot keep, you know that. But what is actually, genuinely different about now versus when you left?" She wiped her eyes quickly. She was not going to cry in the alley behind Henderson's. "And the cattle season ends in November. Winters in this valley have been quiet for 2 years. The problems that drove the original violence here, the land disputes, the cattle wars, those are largely settled. I'm not saying the work is without risk. I will not say that because it would be dishonest." He turned to look at her. "But the shape of it is different now than it was 2 years ago. And I want you to consider whether the fear you are carrying is the fear of the work that exists now or the fear of the worst days of 2 years ago." She had not thought about it that way. She sat with it. "And there is something else," he said. "I need to say this, and I want to say it correctly." He took a breath. "The worst version of the fear, the one that stops your heart, that fear assumes I die. And I am not going to pretend that is not possible, because it is. Men in my profession do die." "That is true," he paused. "But Nellie, I was going to say something about how even without the risk of the badge, life has no guarantees, which is true, but is also the sort of thing people say when they want to dismiss someone's very real concern, and I refuse to do that to you." She was watching him now. "So instead I am going to say this," he continued. "The real question, the one under the fear, is whether the life you would have with me is worth the fear. I cannot answer that for you. I can only tell you that what I would build with you if you let me would be everything I have, all of it, not just the Wednesday evenings, not just the practical help, everything." He looked at her steadily. "I have been half a life for 14 months. I would like to try the full thing." The silence in the alley was the kind that follows something that cannot be unsaid. Nellie sat on the barrel with her hands in her lap, and she looked at Daniel Sawyer sitting in the alley dust in his work coat, and she thought about St. Louis. She thought about the milliner's shop and Martha's house, and the perfectly adequate life she had built there. She thought about the 14 months of being thoroughly fine. She thought about the clock on Henderson's wall and the 18 minutes she had spent watching the bank door. "I need time," she said. "You have time." He stood up and brushed the dust from his coat. "October is still 3 weeks away." He said it without pressure, just stating the fact of the calendar. That was entirely him, stating facts and leaving space for her to do her own work inside them. He helped her up from the barrel with his hand, and she took it. And they walked back out of the alley into the sunlit, ordinary noise of Main Street. And he touched the brim of his hat and went back toward the jail. And she went back to Henderson's to collect her purchases. And Mrs. Henderson looked at her with an expression that contained approximately 12 years of accumulated wisdom, and said nothing at all. Hector Langston started walking with a cane on the 20th of September. It was a significant moment. He stood at the end of his bed with the cane in his right hand and his jaw set, and took 5 deliberate steps to the window, and Nellie watched from the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth. "Well," her father said, looking out the window at his property. "That is better, Papa," she said. "That is wonderful." He turned around carefully and made his way back to the chair by the bed. He looked at his daughter. He looked at her with the particular clear-eyed attention of a man who had spent 30 years reading weather and landscape and the practical truth of things. "You are going to leave in October," he said. "It was not a question. That has been the plan." He arranged himself in the chair. "And your life in St. Louis is making you happy." She opened her mouth and he held up one hand. "I am your father. I am asking a direct question. Is your life in St. Louis making you happy?" She was quiet for a long moment. "It is comfortable, comfortable." He said it exactly the way he had said a letter. "I see, Papa. I am 61 years old, and I have been in this valley my entire adult life, and I have seen a fair number of things." He folded his hands on the cane. "I have seen that young man come to this house every morning since I fell off that roof, and I have seen the way he looks at my chair when I am in it instead of you. And I have seen the way you look at the road on Wednesday evenings from about 5:30 onward." He paused. "Now, I am not going to tell you what to do. You are 24 years old and you have your mother's intelligence and your own very specific variety of stubbornness, and you will make the decision you will make." He picked up his coffee cup from the small table at his elbow. "I am merely observing that comfortable is a word that describes a temperature, not a life." She went and sat on the edge of his bed. "The fear is real," she said quietly. "It is not manufactured. Every time something happens, every time there is a problem in this town, I feel it like a physical thing. I know it is real." Her father's voice was not unkind. "Your mother had a version of it too when I was young and doing difficult work, before the valley settled." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She decided the love was bigger than the fear. She was right, and we had 27 years together before she passed, and I would not trade one day of any of it for a quieter life." He looked at his daughter. "That was her calculation. I am not saying it is yours. I am saying that the calculation exists to be made." She stayed with her father for the rest of the afternoon, and they talked about other things: the ranch, the neighbors, the new hotel on Main Street. But the conversation sat underneath everything else, patient and unavoidable. She made her decision the way she made most of the real decisions of her life, not in a dramatic moment of clarity, but in a quiet accumulation of smaller certainties that eventually tipped a scale she had been balancing for weeks. It tipped on a Thursday evening when she was sitting on the front porch alone, and she realized that the thing she was most afraid of was not Daniel being hurt. The thing she was most afraid of, the deepest, most foundational fear, was dying in a comfortable city, having spent her whole life carefully not choosing the thing she actually wanted. She went to the marshal's office on a Friday morning. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and something shifted in his face and then went still again, carefully still, with the composure of a man who had taught himself not to assume. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She stayed near the door. "I have been doing your math." He set his pen down. "Which math?" "The one about the fear." She clasped her hands in front of her. "You said the real question was whether the life I would have with you was worth the fear. I have been doing that calculation." He waited. "The answer," she said, "is yes, assuming you still intend to try the full thing." The silence in the office lasted about 4 seconds, which in the context of this particular conversation felt like a significant geological period. Then Daniel Sawyer stood up from behind his desk in the marshal's office of Redemption Valley, Colorado Territory, on a Friday morning in late September of 1878, and he crossed the pine board floor and he stopped in front of her and he said, "Nellie Langston, are you certain?" "No," she said honestly. "But I am choosing it anyway." He put his hand against her face very gently and kissed her, and it was the same as that first kiss on the back steps of Me's house in May of 1877, and also entirely different, because this time they both knew everything it was carrying with it, and they kissed it anyway. When she stepped back, she was not entirely dignified about the expression on her face, and she did not particularly care. "There are things we need to talk about," she said. "Practical things." "Yes," he agreed. His hand had moved to her shoulder, and he was looking at her with the gray eyes and the lines beside them, and all 14 months of separation sitting between them, and the particular quality of a man who has had something returned to him that he had not quite allowed himself to stop believing he would get back. "I cannot live at Me's again," she said. "If we are going to, I need my own household. I own the house on Birch Street, the green one. I have owned it for 2 years. He paused. "I bought it in the spring of 1877. She stared at him. "You bought a house?" "I bought a house." "The spring of 1877, 2 months before she left." He had bought a house 2 months before she left, and he had kept it for 2 years while she was in St. Louis, and he had apparently simply continued living in the room behind the marshal's office in the meantime. "You are ridiculous," she said, with a degree of emotion she was not entirely in command of. "I have been called worse," he said, and there was something in his voice, something rare and warm, and she realized it was the closest she had ever heard him come to laughing from pure happiness. The house on Birch Street was 2 stories with a good kitchen, and a parlor that caught the afternoon light through west-facing windows. Nellie walked through it with Daniel on a Saturday afternoon, and she ran her hand along the windowsills and the door frames and thought about what it would mean to fill it. He had kept it clean and in good repair, but it was empty in the way that spaces are empty when they are waiting for their purpose. She could feel its potential like something physical. "The kitchen needs a new stove," she said. "Henderson's can order one. And the parlor needs more light. Those windows need heavier curtains." "All right." She turned and looked at him standing in the parlor doorway with his hat in his hand, watching her move through his house, and she said, "When were you thinking?" "For what specifically?" "For getting married, Daniel. Do not be obtuse." The corner of his mouth moved. "As soon as you are comfortable, a week, a month, whatever you need." 3 weeks, she said. "That gives my father time to recover enough to walk me, with the cane." 3 weeks, he agreed, and there was nothing wavering in the agreement. 3 weeks was what she needed, and 3 weeks was what would happen. They were married on the 15th of October in the small church at the end of Elm Street, with the valley turning gold and rust around them, and the morning light coming sideways through the windows. Reverend Howell performed the ceremony. Me Dooley sat in the second pew and wept appropriately. Mrs. Henderson and her husband sat beside me, and several other families from the valley who had known Nellie since childhood. Hector Langston walked his daughter down the aisle with his cane, and his white hair, and his chin set at the particular angle that meant he was trying not to cry. And Daniel Sawyer stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him with an expression that nobody who saw it that day ever entirely forgot. The vows were the traditional ones. When they came to the part about taking each other for better or worse, Nellie felt the words land with their full meaning, not as ritual but as actual intention. And she said, "I do," with her whole voice, and Daniel said it back with his eyes steady on hers and his hand warm around hers. And Reverend Howell pronounced them married on a Friday morning in October with the whole small world of Redemption Valley watching. And Daniel kissed his wife with the kind of care and intention that said everything the ceremony had tried to say in fewer words. Deputy Carter Briggs Carver, as the town called him, shook Daniel's hand afterward in the churchyard with a grin wide enough to split his face. "About time," he said, which was the most anyone in the valley was going to say on the subject of how long this had taken, and Daniel took it with the dignity of a man who could not argue the point. They had a wedding dinner at Me Dooley's house because Me had made absolutely sure that was happening, and she had produced a feast that Nellie would remember for the rest of her life: roasted chicken and new potatoes, and 3 different kinds of pie. Hector Langston ate 2 pieces of pie and told an embarrassing story from Nellie's childhood that she could have done without, and Me cried twice more and apologized for it each time. And Carter Briggs made a toast that was heartfelt if not entirely articulate, and the evening was warm and loud, and full of love in the particular way that evenings are when a community feels that something right has finally happened. They moved into the house on Birch Street that evening. The new stove had been delivered and installed that week. Nellie had spent 3 days making the parlor into something that felt lived in: curtains, a rug, a small bookshelf. The kitchen was hers, and she had already stamped it with her own particular order. The house was small and new and entirely theirs, and when Daniel came in from stabling the horse that evening and found her in the kitchen at the end of their wedding day, she was boiling water for tea, and the lamplight was on her hair, and the house smelled like wood smoke and something clean, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the way he had looked at her in Me's kitchen in January of 1877. "I kept thinking about this," he said quietly. She turned around. "About what specifically?" "This, a kitchen, you in it, lamplight." He came in and set his coat over the back of a chair. "For 14 months I kept thinking about it." She poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one and stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and she said, "I thought about it too. I tried not to, but I did." He put his arm around her then, and she leaned against him, and they stood in the kitchen of their house on Birch Street while the October night settled around them, and it felt like the specific and irreplaceable thing that a good life is made of. The first winter in the house on Birch Street was a revelation to Nellie. Not because it was easy. A Colorado Territory winter in 1878 was not easy by any metric. The snow came early and heavy in November, and the valley roads became impassable for stretches at a time, and keeping the house warm required constant attention to the stove and the woodpile. But there was a particular quality to that winter that she recognized as contentment, which was not the same as comfortable and was leagues beyond it. She had work she cared about. She had taken over the practical management of her father's property as he continued his recovery, which gave her daily purpose and kept her in close contact with the land she had grown up on. She had started attending the newly organized Women's Improvement Society meetings at the church hall, where a dozen women of the valley were debating everything from the establishment of a proper school to the conditions of the road that connected the valley's outlying homesteads. She had opinions and she expressed them, and me Dooley, who was also a member, looked on with deep satisfaction. She had also made a kind of peace, not a complete peace, not a final resolution, but a working peace with the reality of what Daniel's work meant. Part of that peace was simply being present for more of it, rather than waiting and imagining. She learned the rhythms of the town's problems. She learned which kinds of situations Daniel walked into with low concern, and which ones required the particular quality of attention she had to manage actively. She learned that her imagination during a crisis was generally worse than the reality, and that knowing Daniel well, knowing his skills and his judgment and his methods, gave her something more useful than hope, which was informed confidence. It was not nothing, what she had been afraid of. She had been right to take it seriously. But she had also been right to choose him anyway, and she knew that with more certainty every week that passed. There was another thing about that first winter. On a Tuesday evening in February, she was sitting with Daniel at the kitchen table after supper, and he was doing paperwork, and she was reading the novel she had brought from St. Louis that she had been slowly working through. And there was a fire in the stove, and the lamp between them cast its familiar circle, and she looked up from the page and said, "I think I might be expecting." He looked up from his paperwork. His pen stopped moving. "You think," he said carefully. "I am fairly certain," she said. "I will ask Doc Marsh on Thursday to be sure." The expression on Daniel Sawyer's face was one she had never seen before, because she had never had cause to produce it. It was not the Marshal's composure. It was not the evening porch steadiness. It was something entirely undone by the information it had just received, open in a way that the ordinary occasions of life did not usually open him, and she thought she would carry the particular shape of it for the rest of her life. "Nellie," he said, just her name, the way he said it. "I know," she said, and she was smiling so hard her face hurt. He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he was not entirely composed, and she did not mind at all. Doc Marsh confirmed it on Thursday. Nellie was expecting, and if the timing was right, she would deliver in September. She wrote to her cousin Martha in St. Louis with the news, and Martha wrote back a letter of such enthusiastic congratulations that me Dooley could hear it being read aloud from 2 rooms away when Nellie came to show her. Her father, when she told him, looked at the ceiling for a long moment and said, "Good," in a voice that was doing a great deal of work for 3 letters. The spring came early and warm that year, which felt appropriate. The valley was green, and the creek ran full, and Nellie's vegetable garden, which she had started planning in February and planting in April, was coming in with the kind of vigor that rewarded attention. She managed the early pregnancy with the practical efficiency that characterized most of her undertakings. There was nausea in the mornings for about 6 weeks, and she handled it and moved on. Daniel was attentive without being smothering, which she had needed him to be, and which he seemed to understand intuitively. He was also, she noticed with something that was equal parts tenderness and amusement, finding every possible reason to check in during the day when his rounds brought him near Birch Street. "You do not need to ride past 3 times a day," she told him one morning in May. "I am covering my patrol route," he said. "Birch Street is not on your patrol route. I recently extended it." She gave him a look that he met without flinching, and then she handed him a biscuit from the batch she had just made, and he ate it standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat on and his badge catching the morning light, and she thought, This is what I almost spent my whole life without." The letter from Nellie's past came in June. It arrived at the post office addressed to Nellie Langston, which was her maiden name, from a man in St. Louis, whose name she did not immediately recognize, a Mr. Gerald Pace, and the return address was a legal firm on Market Street. She brought it home unopened and read it at the kitchen table. It was from a solicitor representing the estate of her distant great-uncle, who had passed away in March. The letter stated that she had been named in the will as a beneficiary of a modest, some $240, which the solicitor's firm was prepared to disburse upon her written acknowledgment and return correspondence. She sat with the letter for a while, because it brought up something she had not thought about in months, which was the question of what her life would have been if she had stayed in St. Louis. The sum was meaningful, not life-changing, but meaningful. A woman on her own in St. Louis with $240 and a good position at a milliner's shop had options. She thought about that woman, the one who had almost stayed there in the comfortable life. She thought about her with something that was not quite pity, but was close to a kind of retrospective tenderness. That woman had been afraid and had made the sensible choice and had been thoroughly fine. Then she looked around her kitchen, with its new stove and its braided rug, and the curtain she had made for the window, and the basket of vegetables from the garden on the counter. She heard, through the open window, the sound of her husband's horse coming up Birch Street on his noon pass-by, which he was still doing despite her protestations, and she thought about September, and the weight of the child she was already carrying everywhere she went. She folded the letter and set it on the table and went to the window. Daniel was dismounting at the gate. He looked up and saw her and held up the cloth-wrapped package he was carrying, which was almost certainly something from Henderson's that she had forgotten to order. "Mrs. Henderson sent you cinnamon," he called. "I did not order cinnamon." "I know. She said you would need it. He came through the gate." I did not know what that meant, but I have learned not to argue with Mrs. Henderson about what you need. She went to meet him at the door, and he came in and set the cinnamon on the counter and looked at the letter on the table. "Good news or complicated news?" he said, reading her face with the accuracy that 2 years of marriage had given him. "Uncomplicated good news," she said, and told him about the inheritance. He listened, and then he said, "That is yours. What would you like to do with it?" "I thought perhaps the school." The Women's Improvement Society had been advocating for a proper schoolhouse for 8 months, and the main obstacle was funds. A significant donation might move the building project forward before fall. He looked at her. The expression he was wearing was one she had learned to recognize over the past year and a half. It was the one that meant she had done or said something that confirmed for him a belief he already held, and it always had the same quality of quiet and complete satisfaction. "I think that is a very good idea," he said. She wrote to the solicitor's firm the following week and instructed them to mail the disbursement to her at redemption, and when the money arrived in July, she brought a proposal to the Women's Improvement Society meeting with a detailed contribution attached, and me duly made a sound that was mostly tears and partly triumph, and by the end of the meeting they had enough committed funds to break ground in August. The schoolhouse groundbreaking happened on the 17th of August, which Nellie attended at 7 months along, and found she could not stand for as long as she would have liked, but she was there for the ceremonial first breaking of the earth, and Mrs. Henderson squeezed her hand, and the Valley families gathered on the site with the blue sky overhead, and the mountains at the far end of the valley throwing their long afternoon shadows, and it felt like the beginning of something that mattered beyond any one life. Her son was born on the 3rd of September, 1879, in the house on Birch Street, in the bedroom with the west-facing windows, with Doc Marsh in attendance and me duly in the kitchen making enough food to feed 3 families. The labor was long and hard, and Nellie did not appreciate Daniel's visible concern during it, but she understood it. And when it was over and Doc Marsh put the baby in her arms, she looked up at Daniel standing beside the bed and said, "He is all right." Daniel nodded. He was not entirely composed. "He is perfect," he said. They named him Henry, after no one in particular except that it was a good name and it suited him, which they knew immediately because Henry Sawyer came into the world with dark hair and gray eyes, and a disposition that even in his first hours of life suggested a person who would be capable of great patience and occasional immovable stubbornness, which Nellie informed Daniel was entirely his. Me duly held Henry that evening while Nellie slept, and rocked him in the kitchen while the supper she had made sat waiting on the back of the stove. And when Daniel came in from seeing Doc Marsh out, he found her sitting there with the baby, and she looked up at him with 65 years of life in her face, and she said, "You did well, Daniel. Both of you. You finally did well." He sat down across from her, and they were quiet for a while in the warm kitchen, and somewhere in the house his wife was sleeping, and his son was making the small, secure sounds of a new person who has arrived in a safe place. And outside, the September evening was settling over Redemption Valley in long gold light. Hector Langston came the next day with his cane and a bottle of good whiskey that he handed to Daniel with the expression of a man discharging a debt he had been looking forward to paying. He held his grandson for 20 minutes with the concentration of someone who has not held an infant in 24 years and is attempting to relearn the skill. And Henry regarded his grandfather with the gray-eyed serious consideration of the Sawyer side of the family, and Hector made a sound deep in his chest that was approximately the sound of a man deciding he had, on balance, done all right with his life. The schoolhouse opened in November. Nellie attended the opening, which was a ceremony of considerable local significance, the first proper school in Redemption Valley, built on a site donated by the town, with a hired teacher coming in January from Denver. She stood in the back of the new room with Daniel beside her and Henry in her arms, and she listened to Reverend Howell's dedication and Mrs. Henderson's practical speech about what the school would mean for the valley's children, and she felt the specific deep satisfaction of having contributed to something that would outlast her. They went home along the familiar road in the November evening, and Henry had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and Daniel walked beside her with his hand at her back the way he always did, and the valley was quiet around them, and the mountains at the far end were already showing their winter snow, and the lights of the town were coming on one by one in the early dark. "I want to tell you something," Daniel said. She looked at him. "All right." He was quiet for a step or two. "I have been meaning to say it for a while, and I keep finding the moment not quite right, and then the moment passes, so I am just going to say it now while we are walking home." "Say it," she said. "I am sorry it took so long," he said. "For all of it, for not reading the letter, for not coming after you, for carrying the thing sealed in my saddlebag for 14 months like I thought if I did not open it, the situation would simply not become fully real." He exhaled. "That was not fair to you, all of it. You wrote me something true and honest, and I did not give it the respect it deserved, and you spent 14 months thinking I had read it and chosen not to respond, and I am sorry for what that must have felt like." She was quiet for a moment. Henry shifted against her shoulder. "I accepted the apology a long time ago," she said. "You know that." "I know. I wanted to say it anyway, clearly and without qualification." She took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers with the familiar particular sureness of it, and they walked the last block to Birch Street with the lamplight from their windows visible down the road, and the night birds calling in the cottonwoods, and Henry sleeping against her shoulder with his small dark head tucked under her chin. The letter she had burned in October, a year after the wedding. She had not done it dramatically or made an occasion of it. She had simply taken it from the box where she kept important papers, and she had sat with it in her hands for a moment at the kitchen table, and then she had fed it to the stove and watched it go, and felt the specific lightness of something that no longer needed to be kept. What it had said was no longer the truth of her life. The truth of her life was the house on Birch Street and the school on the edge of town, and the man who had carried it unread for 14 months, because he was not ready for something to be formally ended, which was perhaps the most Daniel Sawyer thing he had ever done, and the son they were raising together, and the life they were building in a valley that was slowly becoming something better than what it had been. Winter settled over Redemption Valley that year with the particular weight of a Colorado December, and the town pulled itself inward and tended its fires, and went about the business of endurance that every winter in the high country required. Daniel's work was quiet in the winter. As he had said it tended to be, the seasonal transients had moved on, the cattle trade was dormant, and the cold kept a certain kind of trouble from traveling far. He came home to the house on Birch Street every evening. That was the thing she had not allowed herself to imagine clearly in St. Louis, because it had seemed too specific, too presumptuous, too much like building towards something that might not happen. She had allowed herself the general concept of a life together, and had refused to fill in the details, because the details were where hope lived, and hope in those particular rooms had been dangerous. But here were the details. Daniel came home every evening to the house on Birch Street and took off his badge at the door. He had a specific hook near the entrance for it, which had been Nellie's suggestion, and which he had accepted immediately. And he came into the kitchen where she was usually finishing supper, and he kissed her, and he asked how Henry had been, and he listened to the answer. He ate whatever she had made and complimented it without the performance quality that compliments sometimes have. He put Henry to bed 3 nights a week, which had evolved organically from convenience into ritual, and Henry had learned to recognize the particular rhythm of his father's footstep and was quieter for it. He read in the evenings. She had not known he was a reader before they were married. It had not come up, and she had come down one early morning in that first winter to find him at the kitchen table, with a history of the Roman Empire that he had ordered from back east, and the discovery had been oddly moving, this part of him that had not been visible before. She had started leaving books she thought he might like on the side table, and they had developed the habit of reading in the parlor in the evenings, in companionable silence, which was one of the particular varieties of good that she had not known to look for in a marriage, and was exceedingly grateful to have found in hers. By the second spring Henry was walking, with great determination and a high rate of falling over, and the yard of the house on Birch Street had become a kind of outdoor laboratory for his investigations. He was interested in everything insects, dirt, the dog who had appeared at their gate in November and been provisionally admitted and subsequently promoted to permanent household member. The dog was large and brown and unspecified in breed, and Henry called him Bear, which the animal seemed to accept as reasonable. Carter Briggs, the deputy, married a woman named Clara who had come to Redemption to work at the new hotel in the spring of 1880, and Daniel stood up for him at the ceremony with the particular quiet pleasure of a man who is genuinely glad for another person's happiness. Clara Briggs was energetic and practical, and quickly became one of Nellie's close friends, and the 4 of them had Sunday dinners that rotated between the 2 houses and constituted one of the reliable pleasures of the year. The Women's Improvement Society had by then successfully established not only the school, but also a lending library in the back room of Reverend Howell's church, and was currently in debate about a proposal for a proper hospital ward in the valley, which currently had only Doc Marsh's 2-room practice. Nellie was one of the driving voices in the hospital proposal. She had been in the valley long enough now to understand that the closest proper medical facility was 4 hours away in good weather, and that there were situations, particularly in winter, where 4 hours was 4 hours too many. In the spring of 1881, Nellie was expecting again. Henry was not quite 2, and the news arrived in March with somewhat less surprise than the first time, and Daniel received it in the kitchen in the evening with an expression that was warmer and more immediately present than the first time, because the first time had been an entirely new experience, and this time he knew exactly what he was welcoming. A girl this time. He said, looking at her with something that was close to hopeful. "I cannot tell you that," she said. "Nobody can tell you that. I know I am expressing a preference. You have a preference. Henry is already too much like me in certain ways," he said, with a seriousness that was approximately 60% genuine. "A second child like that seems ambitious." She laughed. The laugh startled Henry, who was on the kitchen floor investigating a wooden spoon, and he looked up at his parents with the solemn gray eyes and the dark hair, and the very specific expression of a small person who is collecting data on what adults find funny and does not yet understand the system. "His expression right now," Nellie said, still laughing. "Daniel, he looks exactly like you." "I know," Daniel said, looking at his son. "It is somewhat alarming." Their daughter was born in October of 1881, and they named her Margaret after Nellie's mother, and she arrived in the world with her mother's brown eyes and a voice that carried considerably further than Henry's had, and an opinion about most situations that she expressed clearly and early. Daniel held her in the delivery room with the same undone expression he had worn for Henry, and Margaret regarded him with the brown eyes, and something passed between them in those first moments that Nellie watched and understood perfectly and loved completely. Henry, when introduced to his sister, studied her for a long time with the gray-eyed Sawyer thoroughness, and then announced that she was small, which was accurate, and then asked if she could play with Bear yet, which she could not, and went back to his investigations with the air of someone filing information for future use. The fall of 1881 was the point at which Nellie Langston Sawyer looked at her life and recognized it as the thing she had been trying to build since she was old enough to understand what she wanted a life to look like. Not perfect a life with a marshal in a frontier town and two small children, and a father recovering from a serious injury, and a valley that was still working out the terms of its own civilization, was not a life that aspired to perfect. But real and full and rooted in something true. The fear was still there, in its own room. It came out when it needed to, when something happened on the street, when the winter storms were bad, and Daniel was out on the road, when the occasional situation arose that required the particular set of skills that his badge called on. She did not suppress it anymore, and she did not let it run her. She had learned, over 3 years of this life, to hold the fear and do the thing anyway, which was perhaps the most important skill she had ever developed, and which she suspected she would be teaching her children whether she intended to or not. On a Sunday in November, 3 years to the week after their wedding, Nellie came downstairs in the morning to find Daniel already in the kitchen. He was making coffee. He had learned to make coffee, a domestic skill he had arrived at marriage entirely without, over the course of their first year in the house, and Henry was at the table with Bear and a piece of bread, and Margaret was in her small chair making the sound she made when she was working through something interesting. It was an ordinary Sunday morning in November in the house on Birch Street, and it was exactly what Nellie had imagined and refused to imagine and finally chosen, and would choose again every day without hesitation. She came into the kitchen and Daniel handed her the first cup of coffee before taking one for himself, which was the habit of their mornings, and she sat down at the table next to Henry, who patted her hand with the bread hand, which left a mark, and Margaret kicked her feet in her chair in greeting, and the fire in the stove made its small, steady sounds. And outside the kitchen window the November morning was gray and cold, and the first real snow of the season was coming down slow and thick over Redemption Valley. "It is going to be a deep one," Daniel said, looking out the window. "Good," Nellie said. "We have enough wood and enough cinnamon." He looked at her. The ghost of the smile that was always there when she said something that amused him moved in his face. "Mrs. Henderson's doing," he said. "It always is." Henry was explaining something to Bear about the bread in terms that were not entirely coherent yet, but were delivered with great conviction. And Margaret had taken hold of the edge of the table with her small fist, and was examining it with the brown-eyed focus of someone who has just understood that furniture exists. And the snow came down outside, and Daniel sat across from Nellie at the kitchen table, where the lamp was burning between them in the gray morning light. Nobody in the valley knew that the marshal had kept her return letter folded inside his saddlebag for 14 months. They had eventually learned it, in the way that small places learn things, not all at once, but in the accumulating way that stories spread when they belong to people that a community cares about. Mrs. Henderson had heard it from me, who had heard it from Hector, who had heard it from Nellie on a quiet evening when the whole story finally came out. And the version that circulated through Redemption Valley, through Henderson's and the church hall and the boarding house and the saloon, and across the fences of the outlying ranches, was not a story about a man who had failed to read a letter. It was a story about a man who had carried something he was not ready to let become final, because he was not yet willing to give up on the thing it was about. That was the story the valley told, and it was true as far as it went. But Nellie knew the other part of it, the part that did not circulate, the private part. She knew that the letter had said what was true of her at the time she wrote it. And she knew that choosing him anyway, choosing him with the fear and in full knowledge of what it would require, had been the most significant act of her adult life. She had not chosen the comfortable life. She had chosen the real one. And on this November morning in 1881, with the snow coming down over the valley, and the coffee hot between her hands and her children, making their ordinary morning sounds, and her husband across the table looking at her the way he had been looking at her since January of 1877, Nellie Sawyer knew with the absolute, settled certainty of a person who has made the right choice and lived inside it long enough to be sure that she had chosen correctly. The pale blue envelope was ash in the stove 3 years gone. The saddlebag hung in the stable, wearing the ordinary dust of current seasons. The life it had all been about was here, in this kitchen, in this valley, going on in the way that the best things go on, plainly and steadily and full of everything that mattered. "More coffee," Daniel said. "Please," she said. He poured it. Their hands touched across the table briefly, in the way of people who have learned each other's proximity well enough that touch has become a kind of natural weather between them. Henry told Bear something important. Margaret surveyed her kingdom from the small chair. The snow kept coming down over Redemption Valley. It was a good morning. It was the right life. And there was not one moment of it, going forward, that Nellie Langston Sawyer intended to spend anywhere but exactly here.